Something just occurred to me that might explain why I'm picking up FM stations so strongly, even with no antenna. And that's because I didn't reinstall some of the tube shields, and also a shield over this IF coil, this big metal box. So, let's see if I start putting these tube shields in place, if it makes any difference. So, here's this one. No change there. There should be some screws that secure to the chassis which would ground it better, but even so, I would expect it. If it was going to have a significant impact, we would have noticed something. Let's see about the others. One or two of the shields were missing when I got this set. I got some more around here I can use. So one goes over this little 6AL5 here. Thought for a second there I was going to make a difference because there's a little crackling. Nope. Well, that just leaves one more. Which goes over this. I think it's 6AG5. Nope. Well, so much for that theory.
Fresh mix music. It's Pink. True love.
I rechecked all the resistors in the horizontal and high voltage circuitry, and they checked out okay. I then disconnected one lead of each of the 3 mica caps in this area. They all checked out okay. No breakdown. Capacitance was within tolerance. So I went underneath the high voltage rectifier socket and replaced the 1 meg in the 3.3 ohm resistor. Even though those checked okay, because at least in one other set I saw weird readings on that 1 meg resistor that's in series with the high voltage output lead. In that case, it seemed like there were tracks that had been burned through the carbon that made it seem to test okay sometimes, but like after this had been running for a while and I retested it, it seemed higher, so I figured what the heck, I got this set out here. It's fairly easy to get to them, so I just went ahead and replaced them. So I'm going to put this all back together, and hopefully it made a difference. Well, I'm kind of running out of ideas, but all that's left is the flyback and maybe the horizontal yoke windings. What I find confusing about that, though, is I've got horizontal deflection that looks to be correct, and the resistance readings seem to be okay. So probably not the yoke, but the yoke is kind of driven by the flyback, or they sort of interact. However, when I did test the flyback way back when, I got odd readings. Go back and watch, I don't know, part 1 or 2 of this series. Which may indicate there's an issue with it. Not like an open coil or a dead short, but kind of my flyback tester showed odd readings. But I did compare it to readings on my other 630 TS, and they were the same, so I figured, well, if they match each other, it's probably good. But maybe not. Maybe they both do have the same problem. I don't know. What I do know is that flyback is very similar, if not identical, to the one used in the Admiral 30A1 sets. They both cross-reference to the same Thordarson replacement, Fly number 1. That's a third party that made replacement parts for sets. Well, I got a grungy one that I pulled out of a set that I scrapped. And I'm going to disconnect this from the high voltage socket there and see what kind of readings I get with this. I think I could put this right into this set if I wanted to. The only hassle with doing that is, aside from disconnecting the wires, is the high voltage socket. There's one loop of wire that runs around down inside there and goes to the socket. And I'm pretty sure this base is not the same as what's down in there. Obviously it isn't. This had 4 ceramic supports under there in the corners, and this mounting is totally different. So I'd have to unsolder those 2 wires and then unmount that high voltage rectifier base, flip it up, disconnect those wires, and it's kind of a hassle to work down in there. You can see with that corona ring and all that being in the way. But at least what I'm going to try doing, cleaning off the cobwebs and crap, is I'm going to hook up a flyback tester to this guy and see what kind of readings I get with it. And if this tests good, and I'll double check that one, and if that one still has those weird readings, I'm definitely going to try swapping this one in. Or I do have 1 or 2 other Admiral chassis that I can pull the same flyback out of that aren't quite so grungy. Now, I did some resistance tests on this Admiral flyback, and it's not exactly the same as the RCA, although the associated circuitry is pretty darn similar, so much so I'm sure that Admiral licensed or just cloned the RCA design. And as I said, they do have the same substitute from Thordarson, but just because Admiral flyback equals fly 1 replacement and Admiral flyback replacement equals fly 1 doesn't mean that they are direct substitutes for each other. Just that they're fairly similar. Similar enough that I'm not really concerned about trying it out. Anyways, I've got it stripped down to its essential parts. I took out the width coil and the high voltage rectifier socket and all that. And now I'm testing it. And I'm using my Sencor VA62 ring test to do that, which I don't think I've ever shown before in a video. So I generally just use this side to generate various IF and video test signals and test patterns. But there's some interesting stuff you can do down here, one of which is this ringing test. And what you do is use these 2 jacks, and for a tube type set you connect your leads between the 2 cap leads, one that goes to the cap of the high voltage rectifier, one to the horizontal output tube. Doesn't matter which way you connect them. And then you rotate this knob and you check the number of rings. What this is doing, as near as I understand it, is sends a pulse to the coil, and it then measures the ringing, or the sort of the decaying magnetic field will sort of oscillate a bit, kind of like equivalent of like taking a tuning fork and whacking it. You send a pulse into this thing, which kind of creates some oscillations in it, and which rapidly decay, and the rings are the number of oscillations you get. Idea being, I think that if you hit the resonant frequency and there aren't any shorted turns or open turns, it should resonate fairly well. So in this position, we've only got 1 ring, no good. They say if you get 10 or better, it's good, done, that's all you need to test. So, and not to check any other windings or anything. If this, between these 2 leads it's good, they say it's good. So here we got 1 ring. And we've got 2, 4, 9, 12. Hey, it's a good flyback. And here we get 10. But as I say, 10 or above, in any position, it's good. Now, as memory serves, I did try this way back when, months ago, when I first got this set and I was checking out the flyback and the yoke and all that. And I know I use my ICO 944, that old guy up there, which does a somewhat similar test, but it actually sends out a sine wave into it and works kind of like a dip meter, I think. Doesn't do the ring test. However, I believe I did try this test off camera, and I was not able to get 10 or above. So I'm going to try that again. When I say you can leave it in circuit, but if I try this test now in circuit and it fails, I'm going to take this thing out, disconnect everything, and try the test like this one, bare bones. If it still fails, I'm definitely going to try replacing it. Because they say that there could be just a short between 2 turns, down somewhere deep in that high voltage donut, and the resistance reading will still be very, very close to within a percent or less of the correct value. So you're never going to be able to detect a shorted winding with an ohm meter. But this test will. Oh, I forgot to mention, you are also supposed to remove the high voltage rectifier tube, because the filament on that goes to a winding around this flyback, and it will load it down and dampen out the ringing. So that's out. Got one ring in the first position. 2, 3, 3, 3. Alright, and that's what I thought when I first did this. And the reason I didn't even bother putting it on a camera or anything is I tried the same test on my other RCA, and I also got a somewhat similar reading, so I thought that maybe these flybacks, these sets are just so old, the VA62 doesn't work right with them. However, I just tested this with it, and it tested good following this methodology. So let's pop that flyback out and take a closer look at it. Completely unmounted the original RCA flyback, and now I'm performing the ringing test, and unfortunately I'm not seeing what I wanted to see, which is that it's bad. It's actually measuring 10 rings now, which indicates that it's good. So I still don't know what the problem is. They say the test is valid to do in circuit, so perhaps the problem lies with some of what it was connected to. So what was it connected to? Well, one was the with coil. Perhaps that is shorted, or it could be open. I don't know, but that's certainly something worth taking a look at. 2, the high voltage rectifier via these filament leads. I don't think that's a problem. It's just basically one loop of wire around the core. There's the high voltage winding, and that goes to the cap of the high voltage tube, and then there's the lead that goes to the cap of the horizontal output tube, and then there are the leads that go to the horizontal yoke winding. So there could be a problem with the yoke, although we do have horizontal deflection and it seems to be okay, and it seems like it's being driven properly. I mean, the horizontal tubes and all that, I've checked that stuff. So oh, and there was one other possibility that's occurred to me, is that there could be some leakage in this that's robbing some of the high voltage. In other words, like in this phalonic, I think you pronounce it, material. There could be some carbon tracks or something burned into it. Like, it's a little hard to imagine, but here's the high voltage output. And this is a ground connection, or most of the chassis, so I mean, it would have to travel all the way from here down over through there. Or, if this high voltage lead was brushing up against something, they've got it going through a similar piece of material here, so there's a pretty big gap around all sides, but could be a carbon track burned through here, I suppose, although the insulation seems to be unbroken, and I've positioned this at different points through that hole, so I don't think there's any issue there. And really, if there was some arcing or leakage through here, I'd probably smell the corona, or hear the sound, or there'd be some obvious charring. There'd be some evidence of the issue. I flipped through the Sencor VA62 manual, and they had some helpful suggestions for pinpointing the problem when your flyback does test bad in circuit. One of which was to disconnect and reconnect loads on the flyback and see where the fault lies. In other words, when the rings drop below 10. So I just reconnected the with coil, and it did drop down to 9, which is below 10, and they say that's bad, but it's not horrible. And I also got 9 on one of these Admiral flybacks. I dug out a couple more and tested them. One I got 12, and the other two I got 9. So And I'm pretty darn sure those are good. So I'm going to say 9 is close enough to 10. It's probably still okay. So I don't think that's a smoking gun. Remember, I couldn't get higher than 3 when it was in circuit. So what's left to hook up? Well, I mentioned there's the yoke. There's also something else, which is this guy, I believe, which is the linearity coil. It's similar to the width, and then it's attached to the flyback and used to kind of fine-tune it. So that could be a culprit. I do want to check the yoke again. I did way back when I first started working on this set. Remember, I'd replaced some wires in here too, because the original wires are really frayed. So I'm going to get out this test CRT and get this focus coil out of the way and double check this yoke. You can check the yoke in the same way as the flyback with the ring test. And again, 10 or higher means it's good. In addition to the Sencor VA62, I've also got a Sencor YF33. A little bit older, but solid state, probably from the 70s. It's got a little protective cover here over the meter. Slide that down, and there's the meter, and you flip this down, and the test leads are down in there. This can test flybacks and yokes and provide drive, various test voltages. I'm just going to use it for the ringing test. One thing I like in the manual here is a little insert that shows you. I think it does a better job of explaining what I was trying to say. So you provide the pulse. For a good coil, you get these oscillations that decay. And if there's a short somewhere in the coil, they decay much faster. So that's what this thing is measuring. That is the ringing. Okay, the way the Sencor YF33 works is very similar to the VA62 in that a meter, ringing test, bad, good, select ringing test. It can do some other stuff too. We're just going to do the ringing test. And you have 6 push buttons, whereas the other one has 6 position rotary switch. Here you got 6 push buttons to find the impedance match, and you just go through, try each button, and whichever one gives you the highest reading, that's what you go with. About up to 8. And then we go, about 10. That's what we got with the VA62 as well. So I get about 10 rings on both. So I think that's a pretty good indication that both devices are working correctly. The linearity coil seemed to be okay. Double checked on my wiring for the umpteenth time, no problem. So I decided to dive back into the yoke. If you recall, way early on, I popped this open to test it, replaced a couple the vertical damping resistors. Well, now I'm testing the horizontal yoke windings. Here's how they appear on the schematic. That's really 2 windings there, and where the 2 join up, that's where that capacitor comes into play. So I took the cap out, and here's where the 2 coils come together, and then there's one on either side, so I'm checking 1/2 now. And the best I can get is 6 rings. And it should have 10. So that could be a problem. Let's check the other side. Five, 4. Best I can get there is 5. That's kind of a drag because I don't know where I'm going to get another yoke from, unless, perchance, the Admiral yokes from those 30A1 sets are close enough. For sure, I'm going to pull one out and run the same type of test on it, because I want to ensure that a yoke of this type from this period does indeed give you 10 or more rings on this tester. I've never actually tested a yoke like this before, so that's why I'm not 100% comfortable just assuming that immediately that it's bad, because it does ohm out pretty close to what the schematic calls for. I've now gone through 3 yokes, and the best I can manage with this tester, the YF33, is about 6. Again, it's supposed to be higher than 10. So that just kind of gets me thinking more and more that, for whatever reason, the coils of this vintage just don't test right with these testers. To follow up on that theory, I pulled out a new old stock Yoke, probably from the mid-50s, I'd say. And when I tested this guy, I can get the rings way up there, about 20. I think that's the highest reading I got, yeah, about 20. Whereas with the other yokes, I'm getting down around here, well into the bad. There's no way that all 3 of these yokes are bad. I mean, if you've been watching my restoration videos, I've never encountered a bad yoke. So where does that leave me? Well, one last thing I'll do is I'll pull out this ICO 944. Not as accurate as the ring test, but this is definitely a really old tester. So, and it uses a different technique. So I want to see how they test out with this guy. Well, it's the same deal with the ICO 944. All 3 flybacks test okay, that being the RCA and the Admirals I pulled out. But all the yokes test bad. The RCA vintagey types. The slightly newer type tests good. So I've got one hooked up right now, one of the older style yokes, and it's down here in the bad. Barely though. It is at about 30. So perhaps what I can do is just use this kind of as a benchmark, and if they all test around 30, and then I can figure it's good. Otherwise, I'll do what it says, ironically, in the inside the first page to the ICO 944, saying that before the introduction of this device, the only way to test for a bad flyback or yoke was to test it with was to replace it rather with a known good one. Well, in spite of this device, I think that's what I'm going to have to do, is just swap this yoke out, swap the flyback out, and see what happens. I ended up leaving the yoke that this set came with installed and replaced the flyback with one from an Admiral set. I also figured out that I could remove the focus coil from the neck of this little test CRT, and I tucked it down here. The ion trap magnets put out of the way over here. These are in line in the power supply, so you can't really take them out of the circuit. And I also wrapped a rubber band and some paper towel around the neck to kind of keep this thing in there, otherwise it tends to slide out towards the front. And a nice bright picture now. You can see how much better the focus is now too. Very touchy contrast. Just barely turn it. You can get from complete black to being overdriven. Just in the fine tuning now. See if I go a little bit off of the station sound, that FM radio is blasting in. I really hope an alignment takes care of that issue. As far as the image being a little bit crooked, that's because I because the yoke is a bit off center. Adjust that up here. Alright. Not too bad. And now there's another problem. After the set warms up, I start losing vertical hold. I've tried swapping out these tubes. It's a vertical oscillator, sync separator, and sync amplifier, and that doesn't help anything. So my next best guess is that it's one of those old carbon comp resistors. So it's one of the problems with using them is they are somewhat temperature dependent. I think I showed that in Emerson FM radio I started recently, where I took one of the old carbon comp resistors out of the set and put it on my ohm meter, and when I heated it up with a soldering iron, the resistance value changed considerably. So that'll be something interesting to troubleshoot. And I think that's really the last issue electrically, is to figure out. And then once the vertical gets touchy, the retrace lines become more and more noticeable too. So I think those are related problems. So once I get that sorted out, I think it's just onto the alignment, and that'll be about it, I hope.